Welcome today to our webinar, Justice for Hassan Diab. And today we'll be discussing the case of Professor Hassan Diab with Roger Clark, who is the former Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada and member of the Justice for Hassan Diab Committee. For almost 15 years, Hassan's life has been in limbo. In 2008, he was arrested by the RCMP in Ottawa at the behest of French authorities and charged in the 1980 bombing of a Paris synagogue. Yet at that time, Hassan was in fact in Beirut writing university exams and always maintained his innocence. However, there was a 2011 extradition hearing in Canada, and he was eventually extradited to France in 2014, where at that time authorities unsuccessfully tried to build a case against him, which never materialized. At that time, he spent over 3 years in a French prison. Much of that was in solitary confinement, yet he was never formally charged. And in 2018, he was released from custody in France because there was no evidence on which to base a trial. So again, this never went to trial. Now, 5 years later, the French Court of Appeals has decided to attempt once more to try Hassan this coming April in 2023. That'll be happening in France's anti-terrorism court. It will be done in absentia, but if he is found guilty, he may once again be extradited to France. So advocates for Hassan are now asking the Canadian government to refuse any future request for extradition from France. And Roger's here today to give us an update on the case, as well as to talk about what people can do, what advocates for Hassan can do to prevent this from happening, to take action. Thank you, Roger.
Thanks, Candice, and just a word of thanks too to the Peace Alliance in Winnipeg for putting this together. It's great. So thanks to Candice and thanks to Paul Graham, who's been working on the logistics and technical side of this as well. So very grateful to you indeed, because as you say, this case has been around for a long time. People have heard various little bits and pieces over the years, but here we are now facing a perhaps more serious situation we faced over the last 14 years. Just to sort of maybe bring people up to date to where we are, and then we can go back perhaps and look at the beginnings of this. Although I must say also that the original attack in Paris in 1980 in October was a very awful tragedy. I mean, there's no question that the event occurred. There were 4 people who died as a result of the explosion, a bomb placed outside the synagogue in the Rue Copernic in Paris, and there were about 40 people who were injured. So there is a problem in terms of finding the culprit, finding the guilty party. Unfortunately, Hassan Diab's name came up through various means. We don't even know exactly, but probably through secret intelligence provided by an unnamed intelligence organization in another country. We don't know where it came from. We don't know how it was obtained. But the upshot of that was that Hassan Diab's name was there. Now, Hassan Diab is a name which is very, very familiar in Lebanon. I think at last count on LinkedIn, there are at least 200 Hassan Diabs living in Lebanon. But the thing was that having identified an individual and through some intervention by the media, a French journalist traveled to Canada, confronted Hassan Diab, who was totally surprised by everything. He knew nothing about it. But from there, things went from bad to worse, and it's often been described as a bit of a real nightmare. So Hassan has been living, as you say, you use the word limbo. I'd even go more than that, living in hell. So he has had to live with this hanging over his head. But he was arrested first in 2008. The extradition process concluded, as you mentioned, in 2011. He fought the extradition at that time unsuccessfully, and in 2014 he was extradited to France and, as you say, served over 3 years in a Paris prison. The there are so many points in this that need sort of digging into, but I know we don't have time to do all of that. But the important piece is that, first of all, normally it's not part of the Extradition Act that people are extradited for investigation purposes. Mm-hmm. The Act, and this is included in many, many documents, the Act is to extradite people either to face trial or because the charges have already been laid. So it's wrong. It's a wrong interpretation of the Canada Extradition Act that somebody would be extradited simply for the purposes of further investigation. Yet this was what happened. And for 3 years and 2 months, investigative judges, juges d'instruction in France, did everything possible to look at evidence, seek out. They traveled to Lebanon and they did handwriting stuff, expertise, and I can talk a bit about that later if you wish. But after all of that, after 3 years and 2 months, the two judges who were investigating came to the conclusion that there was not evidence to justify sending Hassan to trial. So there were actually no formal charges. There never have been formal charges. There never was a trial. And at the end of all of that, he was exonerated by the two judges. And 2 days later, he returned to Canada. This was in early 2018. But the prosecution in France decided that they were not happy with that decision of their own investigating judges. I mean, these were investigating judges that belonged to the anti-terrorist court in Paris, and it's very unusual for such an investigation to conclude with a recommendation that there not be a trial. But the prosecution appealed. The appeal took a further 3 years, and then in 2021, the appeal court overturned the decision by the investigating judges and said there should be a trial. I would love to give you an analysis of the reasoning by the appeal court, but just as a small example, the question of handwriting came up very early on. In fact, the Canadian extradition judge, Maranger, said that without the handwriting, so-called evidence, he would not have proceeded with the extradition. There may have been other things in his reasoning, but he said without that, he would not have proceeded. So the handwriting became quite important. It was a pathetic process because France, in the initial request, submitted 2 handwriting reports, which claimed that indeed Hassan's handwriting was the same that was on a hotel card where the supposed bomber had stayed in Paris at that time. Under a false name and so on. But the thing was that part of the handwriting sample was not even Hassan's. Part of it was in fact written by his wife at that time. And so, you know, it was actually withdrawn. The French realized this, so they withdrew the handwriting reports and submitted another one. And this one sort of concluded that indeed Hassan's writing seemed very similar to the one on the hotel registration card. Now, the defense in Canada called 5 international experts on handwriting. Unusually, the extradition judge allowed evidence on the part of the defense. That is in itself a little unusual. However, the international experts concluded that the report that had been submitted by France was unsatisfactory, used poor, if not flawed, process, and basically said that it was not any good. So that's to explain why the handwriting was such an important issue. The appeal court, then, to go back to that, the appeal court thought, well, okay, we'd better find out exactly what this handwriting stuff is all about. So they commissioned 2 more reports. This is after Hassan had returned to Canada. The 2 reports, or it became 1 report in the end, concluded that the defense experts were in fact right, and that the report that had been submitted finally by France was indeed flawed and was not acceptable. It was not reliable, and so even the appeal court itself found that it was contrary to the evidence. I'm not sure where I go from there, but I think that the point really is that because of that appeal court decision in 2021, that leads us to the impending trial, the trial which is due to start in Paris on the 3rd of April and will run for, I think it's 14 or 15 business days. So it takes us more or less to the 21st of April. Hassan will not attend the trial. I mean, that's, I think nobody would be surprised at that. So he has already indicated to the court in France that he will not be there, and therefore the trial will be conducted in absentia. So, you know, there are two things now. One is whether Canada should intervene in some way, pass a message to the French authorities that this is not acceptable. Remembering the Prime Minister's words in 2018 that what happened to Hassan Diab should never have happened. And they were going to look at the whole thing and make sure that it doesn't happen again. The last words are really quite important. So there is a commitment there by the Prime Minister in 2018 to really say that this should not happen. And if it's likely to happen again, then I think statements and messages from the Canadian government should be sent. The other part, though, that is worrisome, of course, is that there is a possibility that the court will find him guilty. The anti-terrorist court in France is extremely vigorous, let's say, very intent on dealing severely with any terrorist-linked cases. Candice, you mentioned the 2015 events, and rightly so. I think that the bombing of the nightclub, the Bataclan, bombing of the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, also 2015, and then the following year, a very bad, horrible terrorist attack in Nice, where a terrorist drove a truck into a crowd of people celebrating the 14th of July, and many people died there as well. So that's the background to the work of the anti-terrorist court. And I really have to emphasize that there is every sympathy with the desire to deal seriously with terrorism and terrorist attacks. And I believe absolutely, and we've said all along, that the victims and the families of the victims of those attacks deserve their own truth and their own justice. But unfortunately, the French authorities, the justice system and so on, has not succeeded. There is nobody there, but there is, I would say, a fairly strong social feeling in France among many quarters that Hassan Diab's the guy, and we're going to make sure that he is convicted. And so if he is found guilty, then, as you rightly said, there is a distinct possibility that another extradition request might come forward. Clearly, this, in light of everything that I've said and a whole lot more, would be quite unacceptable that a Canadian citizen would be not protected, whether we cite the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, whether we cite international law, everything says that Canada has an obligation to protect Hassan Diab in view of everything that's happened. I mean, if there were a solid case, if there were good evidence, the whole thing would be very different, but there is not. And the appeal court actually created its own evidence. It fabricated evidence, or it misinterpreted things. The other piece of the picture that I should mention right off is that Hassan claimed from the very beginning that he was actually in Beirut at the time of the 1980 bombing and writing his exams in October of that year. The investigating judges actually traveled to Lebanon and interviewed students who were contemporaries with Hassan, and they confirmed that he was indeed in Beirut writing his exams at that time. They also approached the university, and the university also confirmed that those exams were being written at that time. And so it's an ironclad alibi. But the Court of Appeal attempted to find loopholes, and the only loophole they could come up with was, well, Hassan may well have been in Beirut, but he could have taken a plane, traveled to Paris at the beginning of October, committed the attack, and then taken a plane back to Beirut in the space of 2 or 3 days, because the dates are clear, and it's almost ludicrous were it not so serious. Unfortunately, part of the prosecution's case also determined that Hassan, or the attacker, the bomb attacker, was already in Paris on the 27th of September. So several days. So it doesn't even make sense in terms of what the appeal court has put together. But I don't think we should underestimate where, the seriousness of the situation now. It's apart from the human toll. And Hassan is married. He has 2 young children. I think they're now 9 or 10 and 6 maybe. But it's been weighing over them, and I think mentally it's a very, very difficult time. I was able to visit Hassan in prison in 2017. I was in Europe, and I went to Paris and met with him there. This was just a few weeks actually before his release. But I don't know what sort of human spirit allows somebody to live for over 3 years in solitary confinement in a country whose language he doesn't speak well at all. I mean, he can understand a little, but not enough. So I think as it drags on, it gets more and more tiresome, more and more expensive. Legal fees, as everybody knows, are very high. And if the process continues, that will just increase further. Anyway, I'll just pause there, Candice, and let you ask a question. I could talk for several hours, so I'll stop.
So then just thinking of that, then, like, you've pointed out a little bit about like the terrorist attacks in France and some of the anti-terrorism legislation after 9/11. So like, what role do you potentially see, like, this larger push for like a national security narrative, or like the war on terror that Canada now is talking about more, that maybe played a part in this, like even thinking of the case of Meher Arar, for example?
Yeah, you're right. I think the world community reacted to the attacks of 9/11 in a way that was felt to be appropriate, and many countries, including Canada and France, introduced anti-terrorist legislation and began taking a much more strenuous and more vigorous view of terrorism. And so the fight against terrorism, or sometimes called the war against terrorism, was a distinct reality. And it would be foolish of us to pretend that those were not real dangers. We've experienced it. We've seen the pictures on TV. We know that that is there. The problem that I see, and that others see as well, is that there is a tension, a social and human tension between rooting out terrorism and preventing terrorism attacks and the rights of individuals in terms of international law, the right to be considered innocent before being found guilty, the rights of individuals to be held for a limited period of time, the rights of people to be tried in a reasonable period of time, certainly not over 3 years. So there are, I think, genuine human rights and civil liberties questions that need to be thought through a little bit more. And unfortunately, with the Extradition Act as it is in Canada, it was basically, it goes back to 1999. There had been extradition laws before that, but the big Extradition Act, the one that is still in force, came into effect in 1999. Many lawyers and human rights people were very nervous about the way it was framed and some of the clauses within it. So that has now proved to be correct. The anxieties and nervousness about the Extradition Act in 1999, and these doubts were expressed by very, very senior people in the legal profession and in the academic world as well. And I think that every worry that was expressed then has really materialized. Sometimes the expression rubber stamped is used to describe the extradition process in Canada, and it's not far from the truth. Generally speaking, a country that wants to have somebody extradited from Canada presents what's called the record of the case. But the question of evidence, the strength of the evidence, the reliability of the evidence, all of those things are not dealt with. And an extradition judge finds it very difficult to refuse an extradition. The fact of the matter is that if there is evidence presented, it's assumed to be reliable. And that is a fundamental mistake. I think that it's apparent, and Hassan Diab's case is only one example, as you said, and there are other cases too. I would say probably even dozens of cases where this has been a problem. Most extraditions happen between Canada and the US, and much of that is routine and maybe even perfectly correct. So it's not to say that every extradition is flawed. But there are many cases, including particularly Hassan's with France, a woman from Quebec who I will mention briefly now, but her name is Michelle Messina, and she was not, well, I won't go far into her case, but ultimately, after 11 years of attempting to prevent her extradition and her return to Georgia, where she would face serious problems. It was refused, and it was turned down at the Supreme Court level by a vote of 4-3. And rather than face going back to Georgia, losing her children, this Quebec woman killed herself in November of 2019. But that's only one case among many where the legal protection that Canadians are entitled to by right, by charter, have been ignored or have been lost in the process. So I think that it's understandable that countries would do everything in their power to prevent terrorist attacks. It's more than legitimate these days. Maybe always was, but the tension, as I say, between that side of protection and the rights of the individual or groups of individuals, that has not been resolved in a satisfactory way.
Well, just the issue you mentioned about the rights that Canadians are guaranteed, and in the Charter, the right to a speedy trial, the right not to be held without being charged, like they can't do that here. And yet that's exactly what happened to Hassan when he was sent to France. There was no evidence prepared to even use them. They held him and they were still trying to prepare the evidence.
Yes, that's right. And actually, I'll just qualify one comment that you made there about what happens in Canada. I think it was last year or the year before, that a BC court ruled that keeping somebody in solitary confinement for, I think they said 11 days, maybe not exactly right, but it's about 11 days, is in fact a form of torture. And since then, it's been well understood that holding people for, let's say, up to 2 weeks is itself a problem. Anything more than that is more than problematic. I think it's an offense against international legal standards. And to hold Hassan Diab for 3 years and 2 months goes beyond anything like that. So just making that qualification, but still, I think Canada does recognize under international legal standards that what happened in France is both illegal, unacceptable, and certainly not something that should occur again.
And I think, as you mentioned, I think people would still be shocked to hear that something like this can happen, that a foreign state can request a Canadian citizen be sent there to be put on trial or jailed, and all it takes is the one judge signing off on it, as you said, and then he's sent there, and that's it, and no recourse. I know that they were talking about calling an inquiry into the case, correct, when Hassan was brought back in 2018. I think that was brought to Trudeau, but nothing has happened since that time.
Well, not entirely. Yeah, there was in fact an inquiry that was set up by Trudeau and the government, but the terms of the inquiry were themselves inadequate. The mandate of the inquiry was to find out whether the lawyers in the Canadian Justice Department had followed the letter and law of the Extradition Act. It was not looking at the Extradition Act itself, what it means, where its flaws are. So it was an interesting exercise in finding out that senior legal officials in Canada had done what they were supposed to do. That needs to be qualified too, because there was strong evidence that some of the lawyers in the International Assistance Group, which is a body within the Department of Justice that is responsible for assisting the foreign country in its extradition request. And just as an aside there, it's a very curious arrangement where senior officials in the Canadian Department of Justice are doing all they can to help the foreign country produce and submit the evidence needed for extradition. It's fine if there are no problems, but it seems a little illogical that those lawyers in the Department of Justice are effectively on side of the prosecution. They are lawyers. They have also legal obligations, how they act and what they do and who they should inform about material. The worst part of that, I think, that I can think of is when it became apparent that contrary to initial submissions, France did have examples of fingerprints that appeared on the hotel card, for example, that I mentioned. Another police document because the person suspected was actually arrested for shoplifting a few days earlier. So he was taken by the police. He filled in a form. They didn't take his fingerprints. But then the supposition was that there would be fingerprints on that document. But it turned out that, contrary to what the French maintained, they said that there were no usable fingerprints on any of those documents. It turned out that, in fact, they were usable. Maybe technology had improved a little bit, but nevertheless, there were. They were sent to Canada, and the RCMP undertook a formal comparison between the fingerprints sent from France and those of Hassan Diab. And there was no similarity. The fingerprint evidence that was sent was in fact not evidence at all. It was, if anything, it proved exactly the opposite. But the worst part of it there was that the officials at the Department of Justice knew that the fingerprints did not match Hassan's, and they did not inform Hassan's defense. They did not inform the court. And that in itself raises very serious problems about the individuals involved, of course, but also the role and the structure of the extradition process. And the other thing that I'll pick up on, Candice, if I may, is that you're right, there's enormous power in the hands of the extradition judge who hears the case. But from there, it goes to various levels of appeal. But ultimately, it's the Minister of Justice who has the final word. So the court may say, yeah, we'll extradite. The minister has absolute autonomy in either supporting that or refusing it. There is an appeal against that again. But there is legal confusion in a situation where the judiciary is in some ways limited by a political concern or a political position. And I just mentioned the Meng Wanzhou case, which I think most of you here are familiar with, the case of the Chinese senior executive woman who was arrested in Vancouver at the request of the United States at the time. And the two Canadians were seized in China. But from the very beginning, it was viewed as a political case. And yet it fell within the, the ambit of the Extradition Act, and eventually was resolved through whatever diplomatic channels and agreements and so on. So it's not that politics doesn't play a role. Politics does play a very definite role. And the treaties, because the Extradition Act, of course, has individual treaties within it with specific countries. So Canada has an extradition treaty with France, as it does with the United States. And the terms of those treaties also need to be examined. I just mentioned for interest's sake that France does not extradite its own citizens to any other country. It's written in their constitutional legislation. So there is no parity between the two in that sense. And the other thing is that the extradition treaties don't do anything to strengthen the provisions of the Extradition Act itself in terms of protection of individuals and rights and so forth. So in the Meng Wanzhou case, there was really not much purpose in looking further in terms of the way the treaty with the US might work. But in many cases, Canada can ask for assurances that something will not happen if the person is extradited. It came up particularly in death penalty cases. There are a number of those. Charles Ng was one. There were a couple of brothers also. And by that time, Canada had abolished the death penalty, and Canada successfully asked for assurances from the United States or from the appropriate state legislature that the individuals would not be executed. And that is now firmly within the extradition process in Canada. Nobody is extradited to face execution. But behind that too, there is also an assumption of protection of rights. Obviously, the death penalty, execution is the ultimate. But what about torture? What about being held in isolation for 3 years? Even if it's not entirely known, Canada has a right, an international right, to protect those rights in circumstances such as Hassan has experienced. There are so many elements to this that clearly show that the Extradition Act in Canada is sorely in need of revision, reform, replacement. It's just, it's blatant. And that reform, I think, happily, is sort of beginning to make its way a little bit. You mentioned that the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights just 2 weeks ago began its a study of Canada's Extradition Act with a view to reform, and has since interviewed, I think, something like 8 or 10 witnesses. They've concluded the hearings and they will be submitting a report. But nobody appeared, with the exception possibly of the Department of Justice officials, to say everything is fine and that we don't need to work on this.
Yeah, I think back in Hassan's case when he was first extradited, I think it was the Justice Minister then was that Rob Nicholson. That was Harper time under Conservatives, and yeah, he made that decision.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, there's I mean, going further back, there's the case of Leonard Peltier and Warren Almond, who's the Minister of Justice at the time, approved that, even though there was fundamental doubts about the reliability of the evidence, some of which was actually retracted subsequently. And Warren Almond, to give him due praise, in fact, recognized later, he was no longer Minister of Justice, but he recognized that an error had been committed. But the error has had such awful consequences. I mean, Peltier, I think he's serving, what is it, his 48th year or something? I'm not quite sure. Certainly over 43 years in prison. And the chances of him getting released seem still very remote, even though many people have lobbied various American presidents. They haven't seen fit to release Peltier. So, you know, to sort of suggest that, you know, this is just a sort of legal wrangle and debate about clauses within treaties, that's all very well, and it certainly is. That's how laws are made and how they're applied. But at the same time, the human reality of all of these, the impact, particularly if there's an error of judgment or a miscarriage of justice, is very, very serious indeed. And I think that the ability of the defense, for example, to examine evidence, the weight that needs to be given to that evidence, reducing the role of the Minister of Justice himself or herself, because Judy Rabel Wilson was also Minister of Justice partway through this. In fact, I think she was Minister of Justice when the case of Michel Messina came up, and she approved the extradition. So that at many levels, personal, social, legal, human, all of this has to be rethought through in the light of everything we know. And Hassan's case has been a very dramatic and very precise confirmation of that need. I don't think anybody would deny that. But at the same time, as we said earlier, there is a desire to find, well, I would say, to find a scapegoat, to find somebody who they can say, yeah, that was it. We can draw a line underneath that case. It's been solved. France is doing everything it can to protect French society against terrorist attacks. And yet, there are these fundamental flaws. But further than that, abuses of process, manufacturing evidence, I think probably is a criminal act in itself. I'm not a lawyer, but I suspect that in international law, and who knows, this may ultimately end up in the European Court of Human Rights. But that process could take another 2, 3, 4 years. It's and a very expensive process too. So the consequences at all levels of what's happening with Canada's Extradition Act and its application are so fundamental and so serious that something needs to be done, and done fairly quickly. I think if the Committee on Justice and Human Rights just initiates further studies and so on, it could drag on for a long time. But I would say, I think confidently, that there are certainly a number of people on that committee who understand everything that we've been talking about so far. And there is a high degree of sympathy, probably is not necessarily the right word, but I think so. I think of understanding and empathy, at least, with Hassan and his case, but only as an example of a bigger process. So
just thinking then of everything you've mentioned, like right now, of course, with this trial coming up in April, like how would you say Hassan and his family are doing right now?
Oh gosh, it's hard to say. I know Hassan well now. I didn't know him at all before 2016, but I've met with him many times. The support committee meets pretty well every 2 weeks, and Hassan is very often present and takes part. My feeling is that there is a high degree of anxiety. I wouldn't use the word depression. I don't think I'm qualified to make such a statement, but it doesn't seem to me that the lives that they're leading is somehow protected from the reality of what may yet happen. I mean, that's been the story all the way through. His wife was pregnant with their youngest child, boy, Jed, who was born after Hassan was extradited. Hassan did see him a couple of times because his wife was able to travel to Paris and was able to spend 20 minutes with her husband, and that was about it. But when the extradition decision was finally made, when the Minister of Justice said okay, he was shipped out. He was in the Ottawa detention center at the time. Not his first visit there, but a pretty bad experience too. In fact, Hassan at one point said the Ottawa detention center was worse than the prison in Paris. But anyway, that's as may be. But he was taken from the detention center. I think it was late in the day, and driven directly to Montreal. He wasn't able to meet with his wife or his daughter at the time. But even before that, he was detained initially after his arrest, but then he was allowed out on bail. And he wore an electronic bracelet because the terms of his bail were very, very severe. He had to report to the RCMP once every week. He was not to travel outside by himself. He had to be accompanied by one of 2 or 3 people who had given assurances financially to secure his bail. And Hassan himself had to pay for the cost of that electronic bracelet, which was around $2,000 a month. Even in some of the more civilized countries, that shocks. But to have it happen in Canada, I mean, it's crazy. But anyway, that was the circumstance when he was spirited away, and he was on a flight to France very quickly. And just to sort of put a bookend on that, when he was released, the French authorities did everything they could to help him return to Canada. It wasn't that he was, that he sneaked out of France in the dead of night. For one thing, there was still a no-fly order against him.
Right.
And under the no-fly regulations, people cannot take an airline flight if that airline has landing privileges in the United States, and that was the case, of course. So Hassan could not take an Air Canada flight or any of those direct flights. In the end, through a number of arrangements, including consular arrangements by the Canadian consular officials. He flew by Iceland Air through Reykjavik. And but again, when Hassan was taken to the airport to fly out, he was almost welcomed by the immigration authorities, I suppose you'd call them. But anyway, contrary to what you might expect, he wasn't sort of shipped out in shame or with difficulty. He was helped. He was helped through the process of boarding the aircraft, and the consular official traveled with Hassan. This was not required, but the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, Chrystia Freeland, had also been very helpful and really wanted to make sure that Hassan didn't run into problems on his return to Canada. And so a consular, or an embassy official, I should say, an embassy official traveled with Hassan all the way through Iceland and then back to Canada. So the situation had changed so dramatically at that point, and I think the real understanding was that people were beginning to realize what had gone wrong. And for me, the sort of underlying theme of the whole story is what went wrong, and what went wrong is as you can see, it has so many angles to it. It has so many pieces. Whether it's the way the law is applied here, the Extradition Act, whether it's the way people are treated in France, or whether there is a denial of individual freedoms that is being sacrificed in the name of anti-terrorism. And it's no accident. I mean, I hesitate to even say this, but there was one commentator that said, if Hassan had not been from the Middle East, if he had not been identified with the Muslim community, it's unlikely that it would have unfolded in the same sort of way. I can't make a judgment on that, but the reality is that the history of problems of extradition from Canada has been very focused on the Muslim community. And I think it was somebody from one of the university organizations who said that, if she had been Muslim, she might have fallen into the same thing. But as a white person, it might well have unfolded differently. That's a bigger and a huge social issue. But we need to ask those questions as well. Is something like the Extradition Act, in fact, fostering a worse form of racism within our society? And Leonard Peltier would be another sort of dimension to that, going back. But the case of Michelle Messina. She was from Quebec, and she was wrongly treated, and it ultimately led to her tragic death in prison.
And in that case, wasn't just that she had actually left her abusive husband with her children. She had taken her children and come to Canada, right?
That's
and
right.
She had, it wasn't she wasn't accused of a violent crime. And yet in that case, they made the decision to extradite her back there.
Yeah, that's right.
She killed herself in prison, right?
Well, the point there, perhaps, is that in Georgia, where the supposed kidnapping of the children took place,
right.
Kidnapping children, even in a contested custody situation, is not a defense. In Canada, it is. That protecting children from abuse and violence on the part of the partner, in this case, is a legitimate reason to take those children and to protect them. And this raises, of course, a lot of other very important questions of Canada's obligations in that regard. But she did everything she could to protect the children. And even though there were debates about the custody in Georgia, the consequences of her being extradited back to Georgia, probably too grim to even speculate on, but it's certainly the protection of her 3 children and the evidence of the children about the violence. All of that was, it was, I was going to say self-evident, but obviously not self-evident enough to rectify the abusive process in that case.
So actually right now I just have 2 more questions, and then what we're going to do is actually have people just raise their hands when they have questions, as opposed to typing them into the chat. But I do see that we do have a number of questions that were typed into the chat, so I will get to those here as well in just a moment. So I guess just thinking of everything that you've said, then, like, what are some things that people can do? Like, I know there's been the petitions to Trudeau, there's been some letter writing. All of this is accessible, I guess, on the Justice for Hassan Diab website. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. It's very up to date. So, and I think the link to that was perhaps given in some of the information that people received.
Yes.
But if not, justiceforhassandiab.org. Yeah, there are many things going on right now. People are writing postcards to Trudeau and so on. I mean, they can be obtained if people are interested. That's not a problem. We're trying to use social media more. We have a number of students at Carleton University, just as an example, that are doing a project on social activism in their 4th year, and they've come up with some good ideas as well. I think the other thing is to make feelings known to MPs. I think that even a phone call, a message left, an email sent, I think it's important to make sure that the decision makers and the Prime Minister's office and the Justice Department understand that this is not just some small, isolated grievance that is being expressed in Canada. It has so much that is wrong. I think that going to the website would be good. There are a number of things, as you mentioned. There are petitions and letter writing. That's great, and I would encourage people to do that, and maybe find 5 friends to do the same, so that spreads a little bit more. And I do have to say that there is also a possibility for donation. I'd say that financially Hassan is not in a comfortable place at all. This has been a very expensive process, and although his lawyer here, Don Bain, has been more than generous, both in his time and also in his non-fees, basically. But that's just a remarkable thing. But the French lawyers, who are very good lawyers, but they fall within the normal category of what lawyers charge for things like this. And so if people are able to and willing to support, there is a donation button, I believe, inside the Justice for Hassan Diab site. That would be, well, very, very welcome indeed. I would like to think that that was also part of the support process. But between now and the 3rd of April, I think that whatever can be done using social media, using Facebook, contacting friends, all of that, very, very important indeed.
And actually, we did just have a very quick question come through into what you were just saying, so I'll just start with that one quickly. Someone had just asked, is there a postcard campaign with postcards going to Justice Minister Lametti? So the postcard campaign, that was to Trudeau, correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. We did that once before, a couple of years ago, and we've produced a new postcard. Again, there is a link on the Justice for Hassan Diab site that will take you to the information about the card and how you can order them. It's a small independent bookstore in Ottawa that has agreed to the costs of the postcard, and so you can just ask for those, and a member of the committee will make sure that you get 10 or 20, whatever you need. Yeah, that's great. Same with the petition. When we're approaching about 9,000 signatures at the moment, and our goal is to at least achieve 10,000, at which point we will make a representation to meet the Prime Minister or his staff and present the petition formally. So it's not just a petition in the air, it's a petition that will have activism attached to it. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Roger, for sharing all those details, the history of the case, all the activism that has gone on, and all the work that you've done. It's really, really amazing and so important. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for those words. Yeah, I never thought 6 or 7 years ago that this was going to take so much time and energy and so on. But Hassan is surrounded by a very good group of people who've been supporting him in every conceivable way for 14 years. Many of them were there at the beginning, some of them providing financial support at the beginning in terms of assurances for bail, guarantees for bail. So it's that's the good side of it. But we need to close this. We need to bring finality, and for Hassan, of course, individually. But I think the questions raised in the whole process stretch much further, and I think challenges which Canadians need to address, particularly within the legal sphere, but I think in the social sphere as well. And the extradition is not a big item in public discussion generally. Meng Wanzhou probably was one of the exceptions because it got a lot of publicity at the time. But very often, if you start talking to friends or family about extradition, it doesn't take long for people to start yawning a little bit. So, yeah.
Well, and I think people would be shocked to hear, though, how easy it is to extradite a Canadian citizen at the request of a foreign government, and for France to make that request and it to be done so easily.
Yeah, I mean, the laws of evidence within Canada are strong. I mean, there are good understandings, good provisions around things like the reliability of evidence and so on. But that's not the case in extradition at all. The word prima facie is used and is in fact written into the process, so that if there is a sort of an appearance of legitimate evidence or reliable evidence, then that's enough. So there is no way of testing the ultimate reliability. And in Hassan's case, it's become very apparent that almost everything that was submitted to justify his extradition in the first place has proved unreliable, unsatisfactory, or even manufactured. And I think that in itself is very worrisome indeed. I think that the question of this prima facie evidence is certainly behind this rubber stamp process, and the feeling that I think Marangier, I don't remember the exact words that he used, but in his judgment, he said that the possibility of acquittal in a fair trial is very weak. He did not see that Hassan in a fair trial would receive an acquittal. So it's a sort of sad comment, but I think Marangier was hamstrung by the legislation itself. Mm-hmm. And he did lean over backward. He admitted expert evidence on behalf of the defense, and he was not obligated by law to do that.
Oh, thank you for that. So what I'm going to do here first is, there were quite a few questions that started to come in on the chat before I mentioned that people could raise their hands. So before I go to the hands raised, I'll just try to deal with a few of the ones in chat here, but we will get to the others waiting, of course. So one of the questions that just came through a moment ago was a relatively easy one. I think you can probably find this out online, but how can I find out which countries Canada has extradition treaties with?
Oh, yeah, online is best. I think there are, if I remember rightly, somewhere between 40 and 50 countries there are extradition treaties. Incidentally, there's no provision for reviewing those extradition treaties in themselves. I mean, it could be done, but there is no sort of automatic review of those treaties to ensure that they're working properly and that there are not problems. So I think one of the recommendations that we're hoping will come out of all of this is that the extradition treaties themselves will be reviewed on a periodic and regular basis.
Okay, and I'm just seeing what else we have here. Just bear with me for a moment. Let's see, here was a question. Does the mandate of the standing committee include a review or examination of the processes with respect to the evidence?
The mandate is very, very broad. And certainly witnesses have introduced that particular aspect of the process. Yeah, I'm not sure. You know, it's as I say, the number of witnesses that appeared, other than the Department of Justice, all of them without exception, were addressing similar questions, including that one itself. So I think Canada has an extradition treaty with India, just as an example of the sort of problems that arise. And it's, I think, well established by international organizations, the UN and others, that there is torture practiced in India on a fairly widespread basis. It's a reality, and it's well established. But so to extradite anybody to India, for example, without seeking assurances that torture will not be practiced or perpetrated against that person also needs to be thought through. But I think that's true of many of the countries that Canada has extradition treaties with. The real challenge is to do an accurate and honest assessment of the human rights situation in the country requesting the extradition. I talked about the death penalty, but it obviously extends much further than that, and including torture. But Canada has obligations under international law as well. And so one of the things that we're recommending within submissions to the committee is that there be some process for making that assessment before an extradition is carried out. And there are plenty of ways of doing that. It needs to be at least built in so that everybody will know that an extradition to Haiti, for example, in the present state of things, would be very problematic and should not proceed. And there are, numerous other examples that I could cite. I mean, as you mentioned, I used to work for Amnesty International Canada, and so it's no secret at all that the number of human rights violations around the world are numerous, and I wouldn't exclude Canada from some of that.
And actually, speaking of Amnesty International, here's a question referring to that. So is the International Secretariat of Amnesty International or any national sections involved in Hassan's defense?
Yeah, Amnesty International was present during the early appeals of the extradition as an amicus curiae. But since that time, there have been interest and expressions of concern. And I think I can say that Amnesty International at the international level has been in touch with the French authorities about Hassan's case. It's not a public intervention as yet, but that I'm hopeful, optimistic that this will become public within the next couple of weeks or so. So yeah, and there are a number of other human rights, the Ligue des droits de la personne in France or in Europe, certainly has been expressing concern. So there are quite a number of organizations, including inside Canada. I think I should probably say that many of the labor organizations, university organizations, CAUT, QP, and many, many more have made strong expressions of concern and have published that concern. the public generally. So yeah, I'd say that there is a lot there, but we haven't won that battle yet. And I think that your mention of France itself and the fact that that the trial now takes place in a social political circumstance that is acknowledged to be moving to what we would describe as the extreme right. There's no question about the makeup of the government now after the last elections in France. It's what we would generally describe as quite right wing. I mean, the Marine Le Pen and others. There are people further to the right who are involved there as well, and that creates an expectation around the way legal process unfolds. It's also, I think, a reality that the political circumstance and those concerns, the antipathy towards immigrants, Islamophobia, those things are a reality in French society. A fairly major French journal, Paris Match, very popular, very widely read, at the beginning of this year published a list of the 10 biggest events of 2023. And among those events were the Oscars, the fact that the international rugby matches were going to be played in Marseille at the end of the year, and the trial of Hassan Diab, I think, was number 6 on the list. And so you wonder why that is. What purpose is there in selecting that out? It doesn't have that significance. It has its significance, but I would think for the reasons that Paris Match at least had not considered, and that is that it's a scandalous process that went badly wrong and is still wrong.
Thank you for those comments as well. Now we have a question here, and I think again that's probably easily found on the Hassan Diab support website. Do you have a checklist of officials we can write to about this?
Oh gosh. Well, again, the website would give you guidance on that. I think Minister David Lametti, certainly. We've had various meetings at a small level, individual level. I think expressions of concern to Minister Lametti. Trudeau, of course, but that's taken care of a little bit through the postcard process. Other officials, I don't know. I think most other officials would just pass the expressions on to to Lametti. He's sort of the catch-all in this process, and the foreign affairs also. I mean, it's not just a matter for the Department of Justice. It's also a matter for external affairs or foreign affairs. Yeah, I think that's the way to go. But also approaches to people's individual prime MPs, I think, would be also useful. It creates a sense of more generalized concern at a deeper level in society.
So we're almost through the chat questions, and I will get to the 2 people that have their hands raised in just a quick moment. So here's one just about the Dawn Walker case. I believe the case of the Saskatchewan woman who, again, had left, I believe she had left her husband and taken her child to the US, if I'm not mistaken, and then was brought back to face a trial there. I think she might be incarcerated there right now. I don't know if you know that case, but someone is asking about it.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar enough. I know the name, and I know about as much as you were just saying. So I apologize that I don't have really anything that I can say.
I just know that from my own knowledge that she is an Indigenous activist as well in Saskatchewan, and she does have a lot of support there from, especially from women's groups, from Indigenous justice groups. But right now, I'm not sure what's happening with that. With that case, or if Amnesty is doing anything on it.
Well, Amnesty has been referring to many of those. I don't know whether they've taken that case in particular.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, the question of assessing the human rights situation, there was a discussion at the meeting of the committee about violence against women, gender-based violence, and so on. And that really has not figured large in the assessment of circumstances in the country requesting extradition. So I think that needs to be spelled out amongst other things like torture, detention in isolation, and so on.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I'll just take one more from the chat, then I will go to the people that have their hands up. What about linking up with the US Innocence Project?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure. We've had some success talking to groups in the US, but I don't know. It sounds a little flippant to say that they've got enough problems with their own. I don't really mean it that way, but I think that it's still regarded as a Canadian case. We've done our best. We've talked to a number of civil rights organizations through correspondence and so forth. I think that there are organizations in the States that might be willing to take up the case, but I think that's not really a possibility right now. Be delighted if it were, but it's not, and so we'll wait and see.
Oh, and thank you for that as well. So I'm just going to, just bear with me, I'm going to attempt to unmute. No, I can't do that. Alan, can you unmute yourself and then you can ask your question? Oh, yeah. There you go.
Yeah. Yes, this was a question and a comment for Roger, but the question was largely going to be, the French have done what they're going to do here quite clearly. So I wanted to get sort of down to the practicalities of what listeners and people that I'm emailing on behalf of the cause can do. You've largely covered that since I put up my hand, but and very well, of course. I've already sent out a number of, or given postcards. Joe Wood was good enough to send me a batch, and I've distributed them among people, many of whom, of course, know you, Roger, from your time in Newfoundland. And I'm encouraging people by email in Ottawa and elsewhere around the world. But I guess what I also wanted to do was congratulate you on this 12-minute video I only saw this morning, which so ably explains this unbelievably complicated and unbelievably horrific case. And I'm hoping that people I'm sending it to, along with the other links, will look at it and send it on to others, because I don't think you can watch that and not be affected. So if you can collectively, we can figure out more ways of using that. I think it may. I was a bit surprised when I heard you said there are only 9,000 postcards, or 9,000
signatures. Yeah.
Signatures. We've been at this a long time. And
well, this isn't the first, though, Alan. I think I forget how many petitions we've had, but this one's been running for quite a few months now. So it did slow down. There's no doubt. The influx of some of the student groups at Carleton that I mentioned earlier, they're doing a great job. They're going into other classes. They're doing tables in the tunnels and all this sort of thing. So I think the signatures will go up, and I anticipate that. As a result, and thanks for those kind words about the 12-minute video. I think it is worth watching. I was pleasantly surprised at how effective it was. It's sort of you wonder about these things, but I appreciate your comments, Alan, and also the reference to Newfoundland, which is always close to my heart. But yeah, I think that if we can boost that to the 10,000 mark. For no particular reason, but it sort of seems to have a little bit more weight when you can say it's got 10,000 signatures. And then an event around a presentation to the Prime Minister. And that's, I think, where that becomes more powerful. If it's a public event and if the media cover it, which I think they will, because the media have been pretty good consistently throughout these many years. I would say there are some notable journalists that have been part of this and still are helpful. Yeah.
Anyway, I just wanted to say that I think that video is a winner, and the only other thing I can think to do is to send some more money. I was pleased to hear you. Well, I wasn't pleased to hear that Hassan is in trouble, but there's still a need, and I will do my part to try and fill it.
Thanks so much, Alan. It's good to see you after so many years.
Me too.
So now we do have a question, I believe, from Daniel. So I'm just going to see if I can access that one. Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm joining you from Saskatoon. Very much appreciate the Peace Alliance for doing this, and Roger for your presentation. I just wonder if, given the extraordinarily likelihood that Hassan will be convicted during this trial in absentia, I wonder if one of the key pressure points is to receive an assurance from the Minister of Justice or the Prime Minister that in the event of such a conviction, that Canada will not honor a second extradition request, given the plethora of problems that you've identified and have been now quite well documented with relation to this case. I don't think that there'll be any reasonable prospect of influencing the outcome of the French court. It seems almost a fait accompli, if I may use that term, in a very Kafkaesque kind of way. But I think it's really important that we put pressure on the Minister of Justice to exercise his autonomy to refuse a second extradition request, because then there'll be no question with respect to whether or not Hassan will be imprisoned, because that will be the outcome. Secondly, I wonder if there's been any thought given to trying to arrange a cross-party meeting with MPs of racialized MPs, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, those who often will know from their own life experience how racialized Canadians are treated by the justice system in Canada, and bring this case to their attention. Certainly there's a Muslim Liberal caucus. There are a number of MPs on the Liberal side that are Muslim, I think, who would be quite interested. I think on the Conservative side, there are at least one Muslim caucus member. And certainly, I think trying to enlist the attention of the leader of the NDP, himself a racialized Canadian who's experienced terrible prejudice and racial opprobrium in his public life. I'm really thinking there's a need to make this nonpartisan and to make this an issue of legal principle. And so I wonder if it's possible, perhaps, to provide the video, that excellent video, and I agree with Alan, provide that video to these MPs directly, ask them, and then ask for a meeting with them, and just indicate how dire this is. And perhaps that might be a useful strategy. Lastly, I simply note that there was a question about involving Innocence Canada or Innocence US. My understanding of the term, and I'm a lawyer by training, so my understanding of the terms of reference of those organizations is to deal with cases of wrongfully accused and imprisoned within their respective countries. Hassan has not been accused of anything in Canada, so I don't believe their mandate would allow them to review something like this. They might offer an opinion and say this is wrong, but I don't think in terms of what they actually do that it would fall within their bailiwick. And then just as an aside, since I'm in Saskatoon, I know a little bit about the Dawn Walker case. So she is back in Canada. She's been released on bail. She's represented by Mary Heenan of Heenan and Associates in Toronto. And I think a trial date is going to be, well, there'll be probably a preliminary hearing set sometime in the fall of this year. But she is free in the community. So that's, to the best of my knowledge, that's where that stands. So I'm really hoping that trying to get some pressure on the Medi not to honor a second extradition request if that were to happen. And of course, it'll be very interesting to see what the committee who has studied the Extradition Act say about it and what recommendations they make. And then I think there's an opportunity to try to, while that goes through committee, to try to, again, pressure MPs to use Hassan Diab as an example of how broken that legislation is and why it needs to be changed. So those are my comments, and thanks very much
Daniel.
for this presentation.
No, good comments. Part of the postcard initiative and the petition, in fact, do make that specific request that the Canadian government refuse a second extradition. I doubt that we're going to get a public declaration along those lines, but who knows? As far as the racialized MPs are concerned, we have had some individual approaches there, maybe not in a more coherent way as you're describing it. Although I would say, I think that the agreement of the committee to undertake this review came out of some of those private meetings. So I think not all the committee are on side there by any means, and the hearings were very civilized, I would describe them as, and sympathetic. But the final report may reflect sort of different positions. A little bit afraid that the Conservative Party view is to come up with something that will just make it more efficient. They'll sort of say, yeah, we can accelerate this, or we can do it better. But so I'm not sure. But I think that we're well on the way. We've got very good contacts there. But whether we can do something a little bit more coherent, we'll look into that and see what we can do. Yeah, I like the idea of getting that video out. It's concise. It's just 12 minutes, and I think it covers the essential. Maybe that's something we should send to each MP at this point. I don't know. Well, I'll talk to the
and every senator. And every senator,
and
because
every
the Senate
yeah.
can do its own investigation as well. So, and certainly they're going to be the ones who are going to be also reviewing any legislation that may be passed through the House with respect to amending this bill. So, yeah, to get the senators alive to this sooner rather than later would probably be a good thing.
That's right. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, definitely. And we've had better success actually with meeting some of the senators at various times over the last few years. Senator Kim Pate notably has been very, very helpful in many ways. So thank you for those. Thanks for those comments. And I made comments about Newfoundland. I also lived for 4 years in Saskatoon. So
well, and I met you at several Amnesty meetings in Saskatoon when you were the Secretary General. So it's sort of nice to make that connection.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, bye now.
So I think at this point we have maybe just about under 10 minutes left from what I can see. So we have one other question in chat, which I will get to in just a moment. But just before I do that, anybody that's watching today, feel free to sign up for our Peace Alliance newsletter as well. It's a online newsletter at peacealliancewinnipeg.ca. And that, of course, is our website as well. And you can sign up for a membership, a one-year membership online, which then allows you to vote at our AGM. To become a member. So we do have a question here, Roger. Is Hassan's security guaranteed if the minister doesn't agree to an extradition in the event of a guilty verdict? For example, being captured by the French agents whisked out of Canada.
Oh, I don't even want to speculate on that. I mean, yeah, it's certainly something that needs to be thought through. Even in the early days, before he was arrested by the RCMP, he was followed by unidentified individuals that were almost certainly either CSIS or RCMP. So there was a lot of intrusion into his life at that time, and so it's not something that we should just dismiss out of hand either. There's a lot of anger around identity, and Islamophobia is one more very evident example of that. But the discussions around anti-Semitism, the sort of role with regard to Palestine, the Canadian position on apartheid Israel. I mean, these bring about a great degree of hostility, and unfortunately what we're seeing, at least south of the border, is that these issues in fact turn into a serious level of violence and tragedy. So I think it would be wrong of us, particularly in an age where social media seems to boost that sort of anger. The Freedom Convoy in Ottawa was just another example of the ability of groups to, I was going to say manufacture protest. It's not even as carefully done, but it's to bring together the dissatisfied and the angry and the frustrated, even though those angers and frustrations may be perfectly legitimate. You know, if you're homeless and you see people being given benefits, or you know, these are discussions that have come out in our society in the last few years, and the sense that the government isn't doing enough about it. We'll take matters into our own hand. I think that's a reality that we're not very good at dealing with, and social media seems to be getting better and better at strengthening those attitudes and positions and actions. I think it's the actions that are the problem. Well, anyway, I won't get carried away on that one, but I think there's some very deep issues that as a society we haven't yet dealt with. It's around all of the things that we've discussed today.
Yeah, those would be all of my questions for now. And unless anyone else has anything, I think at this point we can wrap it up.
Okay, well, I just want to say thanks to everybody who's been part of this. You can't imagine how reassuring it is to have good, strong friends and supporters and so on. That's one of the sort of benefits of becoming involved in something as important as this, that the people are genuinely concerned and they're willing to speak out and make their feelings known and sign petitions and so on. Sometimes it can be very lonely sort of work, human rights activity. It's not always the case that people come together in a bigger sort of way. And so I very much appreciate that Peace Alliance was able to put this together, and that all of you took part. Love the questions, very important.
And thank you so much, Roger, on behalf of Peace Alliance Winnipeg, of course, Paul and myself for joining us today and speaking to everyone, sharing your insights on this important case, and especially the different pieces about what people can do, you know, to make a difference and get involved on behalf of Hassan, of course, and his family.
Well, maybe we can have another Zoom call in a few months' time and celebrate.
Very good. Yes, we'll hope, of course. And thank you so much for everything.